In 1964, British foreign correspondent Ivor Davies had unparalleled access to the Beatles on their 1964 North American tour and wrote a fascinating account entitled The Beatles and Me on Tour. Now, to celebrate the 60th anniversary and the new special edition of the book, I'm delighted to be joined on Words of Wisdom by Ivor himself. Welcome, Ivor.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks for having me on.
I'm sorry to drag you away from the Premiership match between Manchester United and Man
Oh,
City, but
well,
there we go.
I'm a soccer fan, and I know we don't want to talk about soccer, but I knew that City would clobber United. Psychologically, they were inferior right now, but United used to have they had their glory days, and I'm sure they'll come back again. I'm sorry, we don't talk about soccer, but
No. We won't talk about football. I might lose a few subscribers if we talk about football.
yes.
Before discussing the 64 talk, tell me about how you became George Harrison's ghostwriter.
Well, that was part of the amazing serendipity element of my career. I was working for the Daily Express in Hollywood, and I think I was the nearest guy to San Francisco because I got a call in the morning in August of '64, and David English, the editor, said to me, "Get on the plane, and the boys are arriving in San Francisco, and you're going to be traveling with them. We've arranged it, and you also will be writing George Harrison's column for the Daily Express." I mean, to be honest with you, Colin, I knew very little about the Beatles because we didn't have internet. We didn't have this magnificent system that tells you that if you cough in Cardiff, I can say bless you in California. So anyway, so I got on the plane. I'd seen them on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I'd seen what 75 million people, 74 million people listen and watch them all on the television. Ed Sullivan was like Sunday night at the Palladium. He was the big attraction, and they were phenomenal. And I saw that, and I heard it when the screaming died down, and I thought, well, this must be quite big. But to be honest with you, I was naive and really innocent when I arrived in San Francisco and joined the Beatles. But that's how it happens. It happens by pure fluke. And there you go.
And the first few articles that you wrote were completely made up.
Well, they were,
And I
yeah.
gather that
I mean,
George wasn't too impressed.
I'd like to plead innocent by way of explanation. George was supposed to sit down with me every day and tell me what went on in his mind. Well, I want to tell you that George Harrison of '64 was not the most outgoing of the Beatles. He was a bit taciturn. He was quiet. He was so quiet, they called him the Quiet Beatle. So I had a hard time talking to him because he was sleeping at 2 in the afternoon. He woke up at 2 in the afternoon when my deadline was 2 hours past. And so I made it up, and I confessed to you that I did. And then George finally twigged because his mum called him and said, "What sort of rubbish is appearing in the Daily Express under your name?" So George confronted me, and we had a little showdown. And I said, "George, tell me what's going on in your mind, please." And he finally he did, and the columns improved, and his mother never called him complaining.
It must have been very difficult writing the articles because you must have had one hand tied behind your back. Because I guess there were some things that you'd love to have reported on that you were unable to put into print in those
You
days.
are absolutely right, Colin. So I mean, here's the thing: I was a stranger that came to the Beatles in San Francisco in the summer of '64. Derek Taylor, who was a great guy, I mean, he used to work on the Daily Express, immediately embraced me, took me to meet the Beatles. They couldn't give a flying you know what because I was just another face. But then after 2 or 3 days, they realized I wasn't going to blow the whistle on things that were going on because I was already a member of the family. And when you're a member of the family, you don't tell tales out of school. So, and I knew that if I wrote stuff that was negative, and I wasn't going to, not that I was looking for negative stuff, that Brian Epstein would say to me, "Ivor, we've lost your ticket on our private jet. Bye bye." So, we softened it. And Brian was desperate, absolutely desperate to make a success of the Beatles. He had seen what happened to guys like Cliff Richard and Tommy Steele, who did quite well, but not as big as the Beatles when they came to America. And Brian was fastidious and passionate about his boys, and that was it. I knew it, and I learned it quickly.
Did Brian actually check the copy that you sent back to London?
No, Brian never interfered at all with it. But I knew that he would, if there was some negative stuff that I'd written. And to be honest with you, I mean, what I wrote was kind of almost, golly gee whiz, isn't this fantastic? Look at this Beatlemania spreading across North America like a disease, like the plague. Bad comparison of words, but you know what I mean. So I got onto the bandwagon, I rang the bell, banged the drum, and was stunned personally by the reception they got in '64.
What was the one story that you would like to have written at that time but were unable to do so?
Well, being a Fleet Street journalist, you really go for the good and the bad. And then there was a story that actually happened in Las Vegas very early in the tour when a young and underage girl was found by her a rather intoxicated mother in the Beatles' suite. And everybody said nothing was going on. And the woman called the cops, and the cops came down. And some of us who weren't there vouched for the Beatles, what's the word, purity, if you like, and that went away. But I want to tell you that if at Las Vegas, like a week or less into the tour, a bad story would have broken, Brian would have had a fit, and who would have known what would have happened. So, I mean, I won't say, I would definitely say I did not, I wasn't urged to write the story. The other story, now that you mentioned it, or you're talking about the good times or the weird times, was in Atlantic City. The Beatles invited me and the other journalists for a private screening of their first movie, A Hard Day's Night. Okay, so we all go up to the suite, and we're there with the Beatles, and just before the lights go down, the promoter of the Beatles show opens the door, and 6 young women, somewhat scantily clad, walk in, and the promoter says to the Beatles, literally, take your pick. And the Beatles, of course, they like candy, and so they went out with the girls. The lights went down. We saw the movie. And when the lights came up again, the girls and the Beatles were back in the room. So, they probably took them out for a walk down the boardwalk to show them the sights. I can just guess that happened. But anyway, and I thought it was kind of odd. Fortunately, Brian wasn't there at the time. I think he was in New York. And so he would have had a fit if he'd known that. So in today's era, if that would have happened, that would have been all over the papers. I mean, they did it, the innocent way they did it. I mean, they bring them in front of us journalists and say, take your pick to these young women. And off go the Beatles thinking that they've hit gold. And then they come back. So those are the kind of stories we didn't write about.
I'm sure they all went out together and had a nice cup of tea and cake in a tea shop.
Exactly. They had a nice cup of tea and probably, I'm going to say, I'm sorry, muffins and crumpets.
Okay. You mentioned Vegas. I believe that Liberace insisted on meeting the Beatles during that stay in Vegas. How did they all get on together? Because you're talking about the sort of new showbiz world colliding with the old showbiz.
Well, the interesting thing was Brian was very careful on the tour to make sure that certain, quote, celebrities, unquote, did not get to meet the Beatles, because a lot of them, like Jayne Mansfield, were dying to, get a bit of the Beatle glitter. And Jayne Mansfield, for example, was a tremendous publicity huckster. I mean, there's no doubt about it. She sold it. So, but Liberace, they met, and I don't think they got on that brilliantly well, And somebody said, what does he do? What does Liberace do? He plays the piano. Oh, okay. And, Liberace, I don't think would have gone out for a rollicking night with the Beatles. He wasn't that type of guy, or maybe he was, and I didn't know. So many, Shirley Temple, for example, on the opening night in San Francisco, came backstage. And Shirley Temple was a star in America. I don't know whether the Beatles really knew her, to be honest. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But she came backstage with her husband and her daughter, and they posed for some lovely pictures. And George was kind of grumpy. I mean, who the hell is this woman coming to see us before the show? So they were very cagey about meeting celebrities. The one they weren't cagey about, and I don't want to go on too long, was Bob Dylan, because George loved Bob Dylan, introduced the Beatles to Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan showed up at parties with his girlfriend, a lady named Joan Baez. And in my new book, I'm going to add this, I got some wonderful stories about Joan Baez becoming a Beatle groupie and taking a fancy to John Lennon. But a lot of people took a fancy to John Lennon. Anyway, that's a rather long-winded answer to your short question, Colin.
Oh, that's great, thanks. And I believe they also hooked up with Groucho Marx in LA. Did they
Yes,
keep up with his wit? Did they match
yeah,
him?
well, to be honest with you, Groucho Marx was a grouch. Okay, he showed up at a garden party with his granddaughter, I think, or maybe not with his granddaughter, because the rule of this garden party, which was a fundraiser for the Hemophiliac Foundation, was you were a star and you were allowed in as long as you brought along a child, somebody of a young age. And so the stars all brought their children. Dean Martin and people like that brought their kids. But Groucho didn't bring anybody. And I remember, this is a true story. I remember there was a great buffet, and we went into the buffet, and there was Groucho talking to Zsa Zsa Gabor, who was a kind of crazy, rather wonderful actress with her sisters from Hungary. And Zsa Zsa said to Groucho something like, "What do these boys do? Are they dancers? Are they singers, or what?" So Zsa Zsa knew nothing about the Beatles. So the Beatles, as I said, were very cagey about the stars that they met. Well, Brian was anyway, and because he didn't want the stars to milk off the publicity of his boys.
And I guess they must have resented, in some ways, being treated almost like a circus act and paraded, with the local dignitaries and whoever
Yes.
stars there were.
Well, Colin, sorry to interrupt. You're absolutely right, because right towards the end of the first tour, John said to me, we're a bit fed up. We don't want to end up becoming performing fleas in suits, meaning that people came not to hear their music, but to see them as almost like a freak show. And John was very aware of that. And I think that, and he certainly by the third year of the touring in America, they ended up. And your wonderful guest the other day said the breakup of the Beatles came, and then he kept it secret and all the rest of it. But I didn't want to go into the Ray Connolly thing. So the point is that the breakup of the Beatles came, and then it slowed down, and then they decided that it was time to finish. And John was very keen for it to break up. And in fact, in a miraculous way, as you know, and as the Beatle followers around the world know, it was the best thing that ever happened to them, because George stopped being a third-class citizen in the Beatle group, and they all went off on their own and did their own marvelous thing, particularly George, who showed that his songwriting talents and skills were superb. And Ringo even did it. And even today, I mean, it's amazing. 60 years later, Ringo and Paul are still touring. Go figure.
As are you.
Yes, yes, I am. Yes. But that whole, you become part of the Beatle family in a strange way. And I've met you through that, right, Colin? I've met so many incredible people who have this link. We are family. We may be in England and California and Australia, but what links us is those four kids.
Indeed, we're all linked across the universe.
Yes, that's good line.
So it wasn't just all partying as well. When there was downtime, you actually were playing Monopoly with John Lennon, I believe.
Yes, because John was, as I think Ray Connolly so brilliantly pointed out, he was a provocateur extraordinaire. If your name was Colin Pike, he would say, I don't know. I mean, he'd rhyme it, Colin the Dollin or Colin. I mean, Ivor the Terrible, he called me, Ivan the Terrible. I said, my name's Ivor, but he ignored it. And each of them had different personalities, as you know, as the world knows. And it was just, when I think back to the time to that period, it was amazing. And I always say, and this has got nothing to do with the question you asked me, my only regret was I never took my iPhone camera with me in '64. So otherwise, I could have had such a lot of great pictures. Anyway, I don't know. That didn't quite answer your question, but if you want to throw it at me.
Yeah,
again.
It was about Monopoly originally.
Oh, Monopoly. Yes.
I just wondered, did he win it? How competitive was John? Did he really want to win and get all the expensive properties on the board?
2 o'clock in the morning, he was very, very competitive. I was amazed because he would cheat. He was a terrible cheat because he would suddenly not roll the dice to the numbers he wanted and he would do it again. Well, I mean, I wasn't going to argue, nor was Art Schreiber and at 3 o'clock in the morning. But what I loved about it was that John, in the middle of the game, would get on the phone, make a call from his hotel to Liverpool and speak to Julian, who was a baby, and he would goo-gar, make baby noises at $20 a minute. And Brian was very upset because the hotel bill for phone calls was expensive. So we played Monopoly. John cheated, and also John played cards, and we played cards for money. And I must tell you right now, and this is something I regret, John owes me about $5, which I try to get from Yoko, but she ignores my calls from back then. So Yoko, if you're tuning into this, send me the $5, please. My gambling debts are in great desperate need.
Maybe that inspired John to write "I'm a Loser."
Oh, one of the things that you talked about with Ray and rang a bell with one of my favorite songs that John ever did, and you'll know it, "Working Class Hero." And the interesting thing about that was, I'm not an expert of when the music was written. You could probably straighten me out. But "Working Class Hero" was written very soon after he left Primal Therapy in Los Angeles. And I knew he was there because I'd done a story on Primal Therapy. But John went to this Primal Therapy treatment and wrote this song, which I think was terrific and one of his best. And when people say to me, "What song do you like?" I like "Working Class Hero" because it resonates with John and the way he felt.
Exactly. And you were actually present when the Beatles met Elvis, which is quite interesting because in Anthology, the Beatles gave quite different accounts of their meetings with Elvis. You were probably the only one that could remember that evening more so than the others, I would imagine.
I think so. I think part of the reason was that on the way up, let me just wheel it back. They wanted to meet Elvis. John definitely wanted to meet Elvis because John said to me he used to sit in Liverpool with his transistor radio back then and listen to Radio Luxembourg, which was the only station in Europe that played rock and roll music. And he listened to Heartbreak Hotel and Blue Suede Shoes by Elvis. Because believe it or not, back then, Auntie BBC did not play rock and roll. I mean, it sounds crazy, but you couldn't get it. So John was always passionate about meeting Elvis. The first year, it never happened because they were all too busy. Elvis was making movies. The second year, 65, we knew that the Beatles trip might come up because Brian Epstein had met with Colonel Tom Parker at the Beverly Hills Hotel and brought them together. But getting back to your original question, and I'm sorry to ramble in different side streets, the fact is, I didn't realize at the time that I would say the meeting wasn't that brilliant, even though in the anthology they wax enthusiastically about what happened. What happened before my very eyes was they were awkward. Nobody introduced them to Elvis. They sat around as Elvis changed the television with his clicker. And finally, Elvis said, "Really, if you guys came in to jam, or if not, I'm going to bed." Well, that kind of broke the ice, and they did jam a bit. Ringo wasn't there to jam. He was playing snooker in the other room, and then he came back and started joining in. But but it was not a comfortable meeting. And I discovered much later because, number one, Elvis Presley was jealous of the Beatles. They'd knocked him off his number one perch. They were playing live concerts, which Elvis had not done because he'd been in the military. And they made one movie, A Hard Day's Night, which was a sensation. And he'd made 3 movies a year, which were stinkeroo copycat cookie cutter movies. So there was that kind of undercurrent of tension that I didn't realize until much later. And that's why it didn't go well. But as you pointed out at the beginning of the question, the anthology says, oh, it was fantastic. And George says, oh, and Paul says, oh, it was the greatest moment in our careers, blah, 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 blah. Not true.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, Elvis, in many ways, was starting a long, slow decline, whereas the Beatles were very much on their way up. Did you detect any animosity coming from Elvis about the Beatles' success?
No, I didn't detect animosity. But again, when you put it all together, why was Elvis so cool? Why didn't Elvis, the host, get up and say hello to the Beatles? Why didn't somebody say, somebody there said, Elvis, I'd like you to meet John, Paul, George, and Ringo. No, that didn't happen. They sat around like strangers in the living room for about 15 minutes, watching a giant television, all of 15 inches at that time, And so nobody did the diplomatic thing. And as I said, all the elements added up to the fact, oh, and by the way, the other intriguing thing was a week before they went to see the Beatles played Shea Stadium in New York to thousands of people, a live concert. Elvis saw it. Elvis saw the accolades, and Elvis was royally PO'd and jealous, if you like, because his career was in a rut. And I think that's what caused the sort of discomfort in the room, and it shouldn't have been.
Well, the Beatles had a rather more harmonious meeting with Bob Dylan, and I believe, once more, you were in the room.
What happened was George Harrison had heard Bob Dylan and told the Beatles, we've got to meet this guy. And they finally did. They admired his work, and they met in a hotel room almost the night before they went back to England. And they were at the airport. I forget the name of the hotel. It was a motel hotel. And I saw this guy who looked like a homeless person with a scruffy beard and a rucksack. And it was Bob Dylan going in to meet the Beatles. So we were having a party in the adjoining room. And they went in there, they closed the door. And later on, when the door opened, there was Ringo on the floor giggling. And they were high, thanks to a little help from their friend. That's terrible, isn't it? Yeah. And Bob Dylan, I later learned, had presented, this is a funny story, Bob Dylan had presented the Beatles with a fat marijuana cigarette. I forget, I'm not into the thing, but it was a fat marijuana cigarette. And what you're supposed to do when presented, just in case it happens to you at the weekend, next weekend, Colin, when you get a fat marijuana cigarette, you're supposed to have a puff, 1 or 2 puffs, and pass it on. But no, Ringo took the whole thing and tried to smoke it himself. And as a result, Ringo was rolling around the floor giggling, which sometimes happens when you smoke a fat cigarette. So that was the Beatles' the very first experience with marijuana, with Bob Dylan. And then afterwards, as we know, they enjoyed marijuana, they enjoyed other mind-bending drugs. We won't go into that because it's fairly well chronicled. But Bob Dylan was the man that showed them the way.
And after that meeting with Dylan, the next time you saw them, did you detect a change in their behavior?
Well, the only thing I remember when the next time I saw Bob at a party with Joan Baez was that Bob Dylan made sure that the Beatles kept their hands off of Joan Baez because she was his girlfriend. And I mean, he may not have laid the law down, but he was a bit wary around them, knowing that maybe one of them would make a pass or try to steal his girlfriend. So even that was a little bit awkward. But I must add, I discovered in my new book, which I write about in my new book, that Dylan said, keep your hands off of Joan Baez, but he didn't tell Joan Baez to keep her hands off the Beatles because she went to a party a few days later without Bob Dylan and became quite admiring of John Lennon. So much so that she got on the road with John and the Beatles for 4 days, and she enjoyed them. They enjoyed their sense of humor and their wit, and she was she was a star in her own right, a big star. And they liked John Dylan. They liked Joan Baez because she liked them. So it was a mutual admiration society.
And were you able to keep in touch with the Beatles over the years?
Yes and no. If you, well, for example, the last time I saw Paul was a couple of years ago, and we went backstage with Henry Diltz, who's a brilliant photographer and knows Paul as well. Went backstage to see Paul at the San Diego Stadium where he was performing live. He was amiable. He was, I mean, he's Mr. Personality. He's really, the go-between. He knows how to handle the media. He does it so well. And he was very warm and welcoming. And he did say, I said to him, when you used to go on the road with Neil Aspinall and Mal Evans in this beat-up old station wagon with no back seat, what do you do now when you travel overseas? He said, we travel in a jumbo jet and we have about 120 people with us, which is a slight difference. And that's the way Paul is today. So I saw Paul then, and then I saw Ringo last year at his birthday party in Beverly Hills, where he is there with Joe Walsh. I think Joe Walsh is his brother-in-law, and he was there with Barbara, his wife, and a bunch of other people that go on the road with the Ringo All-Star Band. And he's always very amiable, and they sing, and they do a little performance for those invited to their birthday.
You, on some time in New York City, John wrote a song about Angela Davis, and you were there at her trial. What do you remember about that trial, and were you able to talk to John at all about how he wrote that song and why?
The answer is no, because I think the years. I think in 1964, 65, 66, Angela Davis had not been put on trial for her resurrection or whatever the charge was. So to honestly answer your question, the time I knew the Beatles and traveled with them, Angela Davis had not been arrested for it. It came much later. So so from that point of view, I didn't even know that he wrote the song until you told me for Angela Davis. But John, as I think Ray Connolly said, John often linked himself to any underdog. I mean, Angela Davis was an important case, but he did that. And if there was anybody that was in stress or was counterculture, John jumped on the bandwagon with every good intention, I'm sure. But the Angela Davis thing doesn't quite link with the time I travel with them.
Ivor, thank you very much. You've been a great guest today. You've not been Ivan the Terrible, you've been Ivor the Great. And I hope if Yoko is listening that she gives you your $5 back immediately.
Thank you very much. And if I get it back, I will take you out to lunch that $5 and we'll get nothing for it.
I'll keep you to that, Ivor. I'll keep you to that. You never know. You never know who's listening.
Thank you so much, Colin, for your time. Bye.